Great. Well, thanks so much for inviting me to speak to you today at the Southwest Fire Science Consortium. Although I'm based in the Pacific Northwest and my research takes place here for the most part, I think a lot of what I have to share today is going to be quite relevant for you in the Southwest and elsewhere in the West. So let's see, what I'd like to do today is start with giving you a little bit of background and policy context for the talk that I'm going to give about cross-boundary wildfire management and collective action to achieve that. Then I'm going to talk about wildfire risk reduction as a collective action problem. And then I'd like to discuss some of the research that I've been engaged in here in the Pacific Northwest that examines collective action for reducing wildfire risk. And this work was involving a study of Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Partnership projects. And then if I have time, I'll say a little bit about current research I'm involved in on the west side of the Cascades in Oregon and Washington on cross-boundary forest management. And then we will have 15 or 20 minutes at the end for questions and discussion. So with that, I will start with a little bit of background. You've probably seen some graphs like this previously, but as I think we're probably aware, over the last 35 years or so, the average annual number of wildfires in the United States has actually declined slightly. But at the same time, the size of those wildfires have been increasing. We've been having more and more acres burned throughout the US over the last 35 years. In fact, the number of acres burned has about doubled. The National Interagency Fire Center used to keep track of the number of megafires over 100,000 acres that takes place every year. And now I believe they stopped because they've become increasingly common. Well, with this increase in large megafires in particular, we've been spending more and more money on wildfire suppression. That amount has, gone from anywhere from 3 to 5 times as much over the last decade as we were spending between the mid-'80s and the mid-'90s. Over the last decade, we've been spending anywhere from $2.5 to $3.5 billion a year suppressing wildfires. At the same time, I should say that federal agencies like the Forest Service have been investing maybe $250,000 to $300,000 annually in mitigating wildfire risk through activities like hazardous fuels reduction. So really our wildfire management investments have been heavily into wildfire suppression as opposed to forest restoration to mitigate the risk of large unwanted wildfires, although that is beginning to change. Well, in response to what has now been called by the Forest Service and others the wildfire crisis, we've had a lot of policies over the last couple of decades aiming to do something about this. And we have had a number of policy statements over the last 10 years or more advocating for an all lands approach to addressing the wildfire problem. For example, the 2014 National Cohesive Wildfire Management Strategy emphasizes as one of its 3 goals the restoration and maintenance of fire resilient landscapes across jurisdictions. The most recent example issued in January of this year is the Forest Service's strategy document on confronting the wildfire crisis. This strategy emphasizes increasing landscape scale, science-based cross-boundary treatments. We'd like to, in the next decade, try to increase wildfire treatments such as hazardous fuels reduction on up to 20 million additional acres of Forest Service lands, up to 30 million additional acres across other ownerships, and to develop long-term maintenance plans to sustain these treatments. And under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that was recently passed, the Forest Service has received $3 billion to spend over the next 5 years on investing in restoring fire-prone forests. Just this month, in April, the Forest Service released a strategy for where they are going to spend that Infrastructure Act money in terms of initial investments. 29 fire sheds across the West were identified for potential investment, and the first 10 have now been identified. 2 of those are in Arizona, 1 is in New Mexico. And the idea now the idea behind investing in these landscape scale treatments This first is, it's pretty much science-based. It's based on what we know about how we should be approaching fuels reduction activities in particular. We know that we want to treat at large scales. So in order to change wildfire behavior, we really do have to do large-scale, landscape-scale treatments. And the idea is to target priority fire sheds. These are landscapes that are approximately 250,000 acres in size, so large landscapes, and we're identifying those places where the need is most urgent. That means that these are places that tend to experience lots of ignitions, and conditions there are high risk for wildfire, but we also have social values at risk, such as wildland urban interface communities and infrastructure that we want to protect. So we're targeting these investments into these high priority fire sheds. And according to the strategy document, we don't need to treat everywhere on the landscape. Apparently only 35 to 45% of the landscape needs to be treated in order to change fire behavior. But that means that we have to be strategic about where we decide to carry out those treatments. And inevitably, we will be doing those treatments across jurisdictions within these fire sheds because they are such large landscapes. Wildfire crosses property boundaries, and these are multi-ownership landscapes. So I think all of these policies really set us up now for developing these cross-boundary partnerships. Right now, the Forest Service is holding regional roundtables to try and get input from both employees and agency partners on how to implement this strategy document and where to invest. I was involved in one of these regional roundtables the week before last, and 5 topics that are the focus of discussion during these roundtables include the topic of cross-boundary partnerships. So people are really thinking about, okay, how do we develop these partnerships so that we can have effective cross-boundary treatments to conduct fuels reduction at the needed landscape scales in order to reduce the risk of unwanted large-scale megafires. Okay, well, I think this policy background really sets us up for a conversation about collective action. And I see, fuels reduction to reduce wildfire risk across jurisdictions as a collective action problem. And what I mean by collective action is it's a situation where interdependent landowners organize themselves and coordinate with each other in forest management activities in order to improve joint outcomes. So in other words, you get a better outcome for managing your fuels if you work with your neighbors than as if you work by yourself. So why is it that landowners in these fire-prone landscapes are interdependent? Well, we know that the likelihood that your property is going to burn in a wildfire is a function of both conditions on your own ownership, which you can control, but it's also a function of conditions on neighboring land ownerships, right? So if your property looks like the property on the left, where you've done a really great job to try and prevent ignitions from happening on your land, but if your neighbor's property looks like the photo on the right, then you're going to have a much higher likelihood of ignitions and fire on your property than as if you both were treating well. So in other words, wildfire risk, you are in an interdependent situation. So when we talk about collective action, I think it's useful just to step back for a minute and distinguish between 2 different kinds of collective action problems. The first kind that we've really heard the most about in the context of natural resources management is collective action for managing common pool resources. Now, common pool resources are resources that are characterized by it being difficult to exclude people from using them, but one person's use or benefit takes away from another person's use or benefit. So in other words, fisheries is a good example. The more fish you catch, the less fish there are for me to catch. The more your cows graze on the grazing land, the less grass there is for my cows to graze there. So the collective action problem in the context of common pool resources is to figure out how to come up with a good, effective resource management plan to avoid overexploitation so that everybody can have sustainable benefits from those resources. On the other hand, public goods are a different kind of collective action problem. In this case, it's also to exclude somebody from benefiting from a public good, but use by one person or benefit by one person doesn't take away from benefit by another person. So if you think about clean air, for example, the more clean air I breathe doesn't take away from your ability to also benefit from and breathe clean air. And I see fire resilient forests in the same category of public goods, because the more resilient our forests are to wildfire, the more we all benefit from that situation. And so then what kinds of action does it take to address fire resilient forests and to create them as a public good through collective action? Well, I think two things are necessary. First, we want large-scale participation. So the more people that participate in addressing wildfire risk on their properties, the better we are able to increase the areal extent of treatments and achieve those large-scale treatments that we talked about earlier in order to increase our ability to reduce wildfire risk. But again, as we talked about, treatments aren't needed everywhere on the landscape. They're just really needed in strategic locations where we want to focus our investments. And so in order to do that, we need to be coordinating with other people so that we can plan and implement strategically designed treatments that will give us the best outcomes that we want from those treatments. So we need to participate with a lot of our neighbors, but we also need to coordinate them in order to optimize our ability to reduce wildfire risk. Well, this can be challenging, and I think this is why we're talking about this in the regional roundtable discussions and elsewhere. We know that landowners who share these fire-prone landscapes have diverse management goals. They have diverse approaches to forest management. They may perceive wildfire risk quite differently. Not everybody thinks that this is a problem we need to be doing something about. Even if you do perceive high wildfire risk on your property, you may have limited capacity to do something about it. So different landowners have different capacities to take action. They may also have different regulations that govern their behavior and affect their ability to do something. And they may have different incentive structures for engaging in wildfire risk reduction. So the question arises then, given this diversity, how can we actually promote wildfire risk reduction through collective action to increase the resilience of fire-prone forests across property boundaries? And this is a research question that I investigated over the course of a couple of years with two social science collaborators, Paige Fisher from the University of Michigan and Erin Kelly from Humboldt State University. And I want to acknowledge their contributions to this work here. So what we did was we decided to try and look at, how can we promote collective action? What are the enabling factors? What are some barriers and how can we overcome those? We addressed this by looking at a selection of projects from the Forest Service, Natural Resource Conservation Service, Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Partnership. Some of you may have participated in some of these projects. We chose this particular type of project to examine because these projects are actually good examples of collective action to bring about forest restoration. So we thought by examining projects that are out there implementing treatments collectively for restoration, we could learn a lot about what it takes to have effective collective action. So in case you're not familiar with this program, this partnership, let me just say a few words about it. It's a federal partnership program that was established in fiscal year 2014. Its purpose is to improve forest health and resilience where public and private lands meet. And so through this program, there are annual investments of roughly $32 to $37 million in targeted landscapes where restoration is needed most. And the way that these projects happen is that local groups on the ground self-organize themselves to compete for project funds. And they submit project funding requests to the agencies every year. And then a handful of those are selected for investment. And these projects last 3 years. and they tend to occur on large landscapes of over 50,000 acres. Most really are over 100,000 acres, and they include multiple land ownerships. So the idea is to fund treatments on both federal and private and tribal lands. So here's just a map of where these projects are taking place or have taken place. To date, as of fiscal year 22, 110 projects have been funded across 41 states and including Puerto Rico. Okay, well, for our study, what we did was we selected 6 Joint Chiefs projects that had been funded, 3 in California, 3 in Oregon. They're shown on the map here. And we did semi-structured interviews with 104 people participating in these projects across the sample of 6. These folks represented the diverse land ownerships that were there, but we also talked to people that represented stakeholder groups that were involved in these projects. And then we analyzed the results across our cases and came up with some insights and lessons learned for collective action. And in order to make this a little more grounded and concrete, I just briefly wanted to talk about one specific project that, that I conducted research on to give you a sense of how this works on the ground. So this is one of the Joint Chiefs projects that was funded early on. It's called the East Face of the Elkhorns Project, and it was located in Eastern Oregon here. This is a 128,000 acre landscape. And in terms of land ownerships, about half of that landscape was in family forest lands that represented about 250 family forest owners. About a little over a third of the landscape was Forest Service land. And then the rest of it was held by one large corporate forest owner who had maybe, I don't know, 750,000 acres, 7,000 acres, I guess. And then there was one state wildlife management area in this landscape, and then there were some BLM lands. And so you can see from the project area outlined here, you know, big chunk of Forest Service land, but then kind of intermingled land ownerships elsewhere in the project area. Okay, so for this project, there was about $5 million over the course of 3 years in funding. A little over half went to the Natural Resources Conservation Service to support treatments on family forest lands. Those family forest owners would apply for funds and then work to get those projects implemented. And then a little under half the money went to the Forest Service for treatments on Forest Service lands. Well, who participated then in this project? And it's common in these Joint Chiefs projects, of course, to have the Forest Service participating, to have family forest owners participating, because that's where the funding is targeted. But also in this project, we had the state participating through the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, because again, they had a state wildlife management area in the project area. Who didn't participate? The BLM and the private corporate forest owner did not participate, although the BLM hopes to at some time in the future. And then there were a number of partner organizations that participated, and they were really important. And those range from local organizations to the State Department of Forestry, to a national organization, the American Forest Foundation. By the way, this is the Wallowa Whitman National Forest that's included in this project area. Well, why didn't some landowners participate? What were some constraints on collective action? Well, for that private corporate owner, you know, they didn't get any funding to support treatments on their land, and it can be difficult for private corporate owners to undertake forest management activities that don't produce commercial returns. And we found this actually across our 6 projects where there were private corporate forest owners. Most of them did not participate, in part because they just didn't get funding support to do commercial treatments. They also failed to perceive high wildfire risk on their properties. I thought they were doing a good job of managing, and it was really their neighbor, the Forest Service, that wasn't treating their lands and that posed the greatest wildfire risk. And they felt like if the Forest Service wasn't going to do anything along their shared property boundary, then why should they? You know, unless they both treated, it wouldn't really effectively reduce wildfire risk on this private corporate ownership. Also, you know, there was one forest manager responsible for 7,000 acres, and or sorry, 700,000 acres, and they just didn't have time. They didn't have time to devote to going to lots of, sorry, it wasn't 700,000 acres, it was 7,000, but they didn't have enough time to attend those meetings. As far as the BLM goes, again, they also did not get funding to undertake treatments, and they were busy worrying about sagegrass. They just had other management priorities at the time. And then there were a number of family forest owners that did not participate in the project. We learned this through a survey we implemented. Basically, a lot of them that didn't participate were absentee landowners that lived elsewhere, so they weren't investing that much in those lands in that area. Some of them just weren't interested in working with other folks. Some of them didn't have the capacity to get involved. Some didn't qualify for NRCS funding. So there were a variety of reasons, and we found this across our other landscapes as well. Okay, well, this is the most complicated slide I'm going to show you today. And this is just to show you how people who were involved in this project did interact with each other. You know, the Natural Resources Conservation Service and the Forest Service have this partnership. They communicated, they planned together where those projects were going to be implemented. The Forest Service actually paid for treatments to do, or paid for NEPA planning on BLM land so that they could try and do treatments in the future. These local community groups, you know, worked with the Forest Service to plan treatments on Forest Service lands, but they also worked with family forest owners to do outreach, as did the state and national organization involved. A lot of outreach to family forest owners to get them involved. And then the Oregon Department of Forestry was a key player. They got funding from NRCS and from the Forest Service to be the point persons working with the family forest owners as well as with the state, because NRCS doesn't have any foresters, not on this particular local office. They had no foresters, so the Oregon Department of Forestry played that role of providing technical assistance as well as some financial assistance for doing treatments on fish and wildlife lands. So there were a lot of productive interactions between these groups. Basically, in terms of communication, there was a lot of landowner outreach. There was a lot of sharing information about treatments. There was a lot of joint planning. Again, these agencies worked together to plan where the treatments were going to take place and to prioritize areas for investment that, in this case, tended to be on either side of shared property boundaries. They invested in places where they could create large contiguous treatment blocks. And they targeted treatments in priority locations that were identified, such as in WUI, wildland urban interface areas, municipal watersheds, and along ridge tops. And they targeted NRCS funding to private forest landowners who were located in those priority areas. Again, the Forest Service also helped the BLM do planning for future treatments. And there was a lot of work to share and prioritize where those funding, the funding for the treatments should happen, and there was shared funding. The Forest Service tried to share out its funding using tools for doing that to other landowners to support treatments there, for example, on the state fish and wildlife lands. And then in terms of joint implementation, there was a lot less of this, but examples were, one example was using the same local contractor to do to plan and implement, to plan the treatments anyway on neighboring private forest ownership so that they could sort of coordinate what was going to happen, because they were basically in charge of planning what was going to happen, as well as contractors doing treatments on neighboring ownership. So again, there was a form of coordination there, but there was also a lot of talk about doing future prescribed burns across land ownerships after they were done implementing those mechanical treatments. So some of the enabling factors for collective action then that came from this case, as well as our other case studies, certainly having funding to implement those treatments, certainly providing technical assistance where needed, certainly forming strong relationships and partnerships with other organizations to help fill capacity gaps in particular. Proactive landowner outreach and education was critical, and it came from a number of players, as you saw from the previous slide. But it was also important to have those legal authorities and policy tools in place that enabled agencies to share resources with one another. And it was important to have shared management goals and priorities regarding reducing hazardous fuels on those landscapes. And community support was critical. And this community was very supportive because it's a place where timber jobs are still important, and they're trying to still support the local mill and the local forestry contract workers. So all of these things help set the stage for effective collective action. So moving on now from this one case to talk about some more general findings across the 6 cases that we looked at, we were able to come up with 5 principles for fostering collective action for cross-boundary fuels reduction that I think are widely applicable. And I want to talk about those 5 principles now. The first one is that landowners have to have a shared understanding of the problem you're trying to address. So it's important to have a shared understanding of wildfire, of how forest management affects wildfire, and a shared understanding that acting collectively will ultimately give you a better outcome than acting individually in an unplanned fashion. It's also important to communicate and coordinate with your neighbors in order to develop those coordinated strategies and share information about what you're planning to do on your diverse ownerships. It's also important to ensure that landowners have the capacity to participate in the strategies that you've planned for undertaking the treatments. And it's important to have trust and reciprocity among neighbors. As I mentioned earlier, with the case of the private forest corporate owner, it's important to know that if you're going to go out and invest in reducing fuels on your property, your neighbor is going to do that as well, so that you can maximize the beneficial outcomes. And then finally, there needs to be a beneficial cost ratio for you to get involved. You need to understand that the long-term joint benefits of collective action are going to exceed the short-term individual costs, because there's no question that short-term transaction costs are high for engaging in collective action, so it really needs to pay off. Okay, well, how do we go about promoting these 5 principles? Well, I think, as I already talked about, proactive education and outreach to engage landowners in collective action is critical. And it's great to target that outreach to those landowners that are located in those priority treatment areas. I think that involving organizations and doing this outreach that have good relationships with local landowners is critical. So like in one case, it was the local fire department that really got involved in doing the outreach. In this case, the American Forest Foundation provided an important outreach role. So identify who has good relationships with local landowners and try and get them to do that outreach. In terms of trying to promote communication and coordination, you really need to create those local opportunities for landowners to interact with each other. So maybe you set up local meetings and include multi-stakeholders in those meetings so that you can develop coordinated approaches with each other. You can also build on pre-existing partnerships to strengthen partnerships needed to engage in cross-boundary work. It helps to use similar foresters or contractors on diverse ownerships. They can be a good conduit for communication and coordination. And then it was helpful for agencies like the Forest Service and NRCS to dedicate personnel to these projects and to have those dedicated folks stay in place over the project lifetime, rather than constantly having new people in those jobs, because that really helps to foster relationship building and good communication and coordination. In order to promote the capacity to participate, again, financial and technical assistance was critical for many of these landowners. Engaging partners to fill capacity gaps where they occur is critical. And then having those legal authorities and policy tools for resource sharing is critical. And fostering a local restoration workforce that can actually go out and do the work is also really important. In order to develop trust and reciprocity, I think just planning these projects with your neighbors involved through collaborative group efforts really helps to build that trust and ensure that your neighbors are also, on the bus with you. If you implement coordinated and cross-boundary treatments together, you know that you're both doing it at the same time, although opportunities to do that may be more limited. And it's also important to try and minimize time lags between treatments on different ownerships. You know, sometimes those private owners who are able to implement those treatments fairly rapidly were a little worried that the Forest Service, who took a much longer time to get around to implementation, was, you know, either not going to do it before the next fire occurred, or could be sort of, you know, stalled for a long period of time. So trying to minimize those time lags was important. And then to ensure that you do have that favorable benefit cost ratio, you can work on reducing the costs to landowners, again, through technical and financial assistance, by trying to streamline the environmental analysis process, by minimizing the time investment needed for coordination and for meetings and more meetings, and then to support local processing and marketing infrastructure, which can help you, you know, retain more of the financial profits from those harvests that take place, mechanical harvesting in particular. Okay, so moving on then from that work, you know, I thought I would say a few words about a project that I'm involved in currently, because I think it has something to bear on this topic of cross-boundary work through collective action to reduce wildfire risk. So I'm currently involved with two other researchers from the Pacific Northwest Research Station, Eric White and Gretchen Engebring, in a study of forest management to address both wildfire and carbon west of the Cascade Range in Oregon and Washington and Northern California. And we're working in these landscapes in 5 different ecoregions that you can see pictured here, because a lot of our work previously has taken place on the eastern side in these more drier fire, frequent fire ecoregions. And nevertheless, though, we're seeing that we're getting more and more wildfires on the west side of the Cascades in Oregon and Washington. Certainly, this region is a high fire-prone area. But even these places that we think of as traditionally being, you know, a more sort of longer fire return intervals, you know, they're starting to get more wildfires. So we wanted to see, especially given the possibility of changing climates in the future that are going to increase wildfire occurrence and size on the west side, we want to understand better what's happening here with regard to wildfire management by landowners and working across boundaries. And so to date, you know, we've talked to about half of the landowners that we hope to talk to. Those landowners, we've talked to 55 folks to date. We're focusing on large forest landowners over 5,000 acres because they control most of the landscape. And we're involving federal, state, tribal, and private corporate owners in this study. And what we've learned to date in particular about cross-boundary management is that there has been, you know, most of these landowners do communicate with each other to some degree about their forest management activities. That communication has been pretty limited though, often minimal. And when they do talk about wildfire, they tend to talk more about wildfire suppression than they do about wildfire risk reduction through restoration activities. About half of them do share resources with each other, but mainly what they've been doing is sharing infrastructure, road infrastructure, in order to help each other gain access to their properties or undertake certain forest management activities more easily. You know, less than a quarter have been engaged in joint planning and implementation of forest management activities. And that cross-boundary work has occurred for a lot of different reasons, but rarely wildfire. The reasons that they work with their neighbors have been, again, mostly to gain access to property or maybe cultural resources like huckleberries, you know, that are growing there that they'd like to pick. Sometimes they do it because they're being directed to by policy, or they simply want to be a good neighbor. Maybe it's more cost advantageous to work with your neighbor in undertaking certain activities like, you know, clearing brush along roadsides. So you'll participate together in that. Sometimes there's some funding that if you apply for it together, you're more likely to get it. And sometimes they do work together for habitat conservation and restoration activities like disease control or invasive species control. But, you know, they're not working a lot with each other on wildfire risk reduction, except we found that happening a lot more in the Klamath ecoregion, where again, it's a much more frequent fire ecoregion. And that was the region where we found that people's perceptions of wildfire risk was highest. So I think the point I'm making here is that when we think about undertaking collective action for cross-boundary wildfire risk reduction, it may not be appropriate or needed everywhere. In certain places, and depending on the kinds of treatments you're trying to promote, it could be really important and we really want to promote it. But, maybe in these landscapes where fire has, much longer fire return intervals, or people aren't as concerned, or maybe the most appropriate treatments in those places are, building fuel breaks along shared roadways and undertaking suppression when wildfire breaks out. We're still trying to better understand what the most effective treatments are on the west side of the Cascade Range in Oregon and Washington. So collective action isn't needed everywhere, but where it is needed and can be extremely effective, it's helpful to build on pre-existing relationships and collaborations. So even what we see on the west side here, people are working together in different ways. And if it comes to wildfire in the future, they can build on the ways in which they are working together now to redirect that towards working together to reduce wildfire risk. So a lot of the great collaborations and partnerships that we've seen, even in those Joint Chiefs projects, especially there, were people that built on pre-existing relationships. So those are really critical. And I think when it comes to working with these diverse landowners, not everybody has the same needs. So it's important to look at what's going on in a particular place, to understand the local context for collective action, and to try and identify the different needs that different landowners in these shared landscapes have, and try to address those different needs when we are trying to engage them in collective action to reduce wildfire risk. And then the last thing I'll say, going back to those 5 principles, is, they work best when they work together. It's really important to try and promote those 5 principles at the same time. If one of them is missing, for example, your neighbor's not treating, you're much less likely to engage in collective action than as if all of those principles are working together. So with that, I've come to the end, and thank you so much for your attention today and your interest. Here is my email contact information in case you would like to follow up about anything. And if you are interested in reading more about this research, here is a citation here. And that really focuses on the results that I presented today regarding the work we did on those Joint Chiefs projects. So let's see, I think maybe I will stop sharing my screen, and we can go towards questions and discussion, which I believe Rachel is going to facilitate today.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Charnley. That was a wonderful presentation, and we appreciate you being here today. So I'll go straight into the questions that we've had from the chat. Both Ramon and Charisse asked about what percentage of the annual federal fire budget is spent on fire suppression, wildfire risk reduction, landscape treatments, and on preparing fire adapted communities.
So honestly, I would have to look at the federal budget to give you an answer to that, but certainly the vast majority is spent on wildfire suppression activities. As I said, we're spending $2.5 to $3.5 billion over, annually over the last decade to suppress wildfires, and we're only spending, have been spending, $250,000 to $300,000 a year on trying to reduce the risk of wildland fire through hazardous fuels reduction treatments. So it's extremely disproportionate, and really that's changing now because of this new 10-year strategy that the Forest Service has developed, to try and address the wildfire crisis. And because, so the agency got $5 billion of infrastructure investment and under the Infrastructure Act that was recently passed by Congress. Of those $5 billion, we're focusing $3 billion on wildfire and in particular hazardous fuels reduction and restoring forest health. So that picture is shifting, but yeah.
All right, and Jack mentioned that collective action as a term is often used ambiguously as a synonym of collaboration or coordination or cross-boundary action. or it's used as an umbrella term to encapsulate all of those. So he was wondering, how did you come to your definition and use, and how do you distinguish collective from those other terms?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I agree with you. These terms get thrown around a lot without, you know, an initial specificity. So I guess I draw on the work of Eleanor Ostrom, who was a political scientist who did a lot of the pioneering work in the field of collective action around common pool resource management in particular. And so I tried to sort of build on her definitions, but I also tried to apply it to the context of addressing wildfire. So I think, you know, it's okay to have different definitions. You just have to make clear how you're using these terms in different contexts. And in the context in which I'm using it here is that when, you know, these landowners who are in this interdependent situation are acting together so that they can improve their outcome. Now, and so I think it's maybe, how would I distinguish collaboration? I think with collaboration, you know, you're certainly working together with lots of partners towards shared goals. And, you know, presumably by doing that and giving input on projects to achieve shared goals, you're going to improve the outcome that you get. That's one reason the Forest Service is trying to push so much collaboration. You know, I think the reason I distinguish them in the context of this study in particular is that I felt that the way the collaboration is used as a term with the Forest Service is in the context of forest collaborative groups that work with the agency to focus on treatments on Forest Service land. And I think, you know, what we're trying to do now is expand beyond that focus on Forest Service land, which again is the way that I think the Forest Service has focused its interaction with collaborative groups in the past who want to give input on those Forest Service proposed projects, right? To expand to other landowners in those shared landscapes and to get other landowners involved. And so that means, you know, it's not just sort of focusing on what the Forest Service is doing, but it's trying to get everybody out there doing something together collectively. And so that's how I would distinguish collective action in this case, is we're trying to get multiple landowners in these landscapes to take action. And I think coordination is a bit different because, you know, coordination is something that you do by working together in order to get this outcome of collective action. So not sure that that's helpful. I think, you know, the best answer is it's important to define these terms, you know, specific to the context in which you're using them. I don't think there's a wrong definition necessarily, but that's just how I viewed it in the context of this research. Yeah.
So it sounds like it might hinge on the fact that this is multi-jurisdictional.
Yeah, definitely, for sure.
Great, thank you. So Gwen had a comment, which was just that if we want long-term engagement by natural resource-based community groups, who are one of the main drivers of collaboration, sustained funding is a key. And it's hard to have sustained engagement when lifestyle stability is almost non-existent. And then,
yeah, you know, I think one of the things that has been good about, well, you know, the Joint Chiefs projects was 3 years of funding, which isn't really sustained funding, but it's amazing to look at what happened to these projects after these Joint Chiefs projects, you know, because, you know, making these initial investments in these landscapes really caused other actors to come in and continue funding them with other funding sources. So like in the case of Oregon, you know, the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board has come in and spent millions of dollars, you know, continuing to fund restoration work in some of these landscapes that had Joint Chiefs projects for 3 years. And some of those Joint Chiefs projects, you know, were successful in certain landscapes because those were areas where groups had worked together previously with other sources of funding to jumpstart restoration work. So I think these funding sources can build on each other to sustain themselves over long term, although, you know, there is some uncertainty around that. Certainly the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Partnership funding that can go for 10 years and even up to 20 years in some cases is an effort to get more sustained long-term funding. We'll see what happens after this Infrastructure Act funding, expires. It's $3 billion, which sounds like a lot over 5 years, but it's a 10-year strategy. And if we need to maintain treatments long-term, yeah, we've got to figure that out.
Great. Robert is just taking the conversation back to the funding element. And he asked, do we know the ratio of savings between suppression, calling it a pound of cure, and risk reduction, so an ounce of prevention?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think I'm in a position to calculate those savings, but certainly I agree with the concept. Yep, I think we need our economists to weigh in here if we have any in the crowd.
All right, and I'll just jump in with a question I had for you. From your presentation, it sounds like a key element in moving these projects forward was for one knowledgeable partner, so a consistent forester or contractor, to step forward and take charge of coordinating project design across multiple land ownerships once the funding was in place. So my question for you is, what resources are available to get the wheels moving for multi-jurisdictional landowners with an interest in partnering for hazardous fuels reduction? Basically, where can they start?
Well, it is amazing how funding brings people together. I mean, it is often a trigger point for getting folks to work together on these projects. And so I think, the value of having programs like Joint Chiefs that say, here we have some funding available to support these multi-jurisdictional projects, but we require that, different partners get involved, then that serves as an incentive or a motivator for people to self-organize and step up to the plate. And so, maybe it's one person or maybe it's a group of people. I think making people aware of these opportunities to get resources, and work together to apply for them is, probably a first step. And, I think there are groups out there who make it their role to raise awareness about these opportunities. I'm thinking about the Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition, for example. They have a couple of resources that really are geared to helping community groups become more aware of opportunities that are there, as well as sort of policy tools that can be used for sharing resources across boundaries. So yeah, but it does take something to spur action, and funding is great for that. But, of course, there are probably good examples of other things that people come together around. Maybe it's a recent wildfire in an area and all of a sudden people realize, gosh, we better, sit up and do something about this. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question from Jack, saying that this may be a bit outside the focus of the studies presented today, but just wondering, how do you envision the role of private property landowners, neighborhoods, and the communities that reside within these landscapes? And how do you include them in these collective action efforts?
Yeah, I think that has been a big challenge. And I think when we think about private owners, we can distinguish between sort of the more family forest owners and the private corporate owners. And so thinking about family forest owners, again, I think there's a really important role for organizations that do outreach to those owners. And whether that's, university extension or state departments of forestry, or whether it's, California, the fire safe councils, local community-based groups who are in a position to work well with individual landowners to make them aware of both the importance of, doing work on their lands, but also resources that are available. When we worked with the family forest owners in these landscapes, there was one case in Southern California where there was like a landowner association that came together and applied for funding collectively. So if you're in a landowner association, you can work collectively that way. Sometimes it was, an extension forester trying to organize neighbors around something. Sometimes, like there's the Oregon Small Woodlands Association, there are community-based groups that organize private forest landowners or family forest landowners to work together to take advantage of some of these opportunities. So I think that's where I would point to those local groups and those extension types whose job it is to work with those landowners to organize them. I think, but collective action can also look like the sort of spoke and wheel model, right? You have a central person, like in the case of the East Face, where there was that ODF forester who went out and worked with individual landowners. Those landowners weren't working with each other across boundaries, but it was that one, forester from ODF that worked with them individually, but did so in a way that had a strategy, a coordinated strategy behind it that had been developed by ODF together with the Natural Resources Conservation Service and the Forest Service. In the case of private corporate forest owners, I think it's a lot more difficult. I think a lot of them are willing to go out and do this work, and it's important because they control such a large, part of the landscape. But there's issues around perceptions of wildfire risk. Many of them think that they're managing in a way that really reduces the likelihood of wildfire. But when you're doing shorter, 40-year rotations, you've got smaller trees that are more vulnerable and less resilient to wildfire than big old trees. So, there's also discomfort there of doing prescribed burns because it might get out of control and, reduce your forest stock. So I think, what are they called? The prescribed fire councils have an important role to play there for making private forest owners, whether corporate or family, more comfortable with doing those kinds of cross-boundary burns. They need more boots on the ground. If they had some funding for private corporate owners to do these treatments, they might be more likely to do it. Some of them do it, but so again, different strategies depending on who you're talking about.
And Tracy just made a comment building off of exactly what you were just saying, that watershed councils are also important partners at the local level with solid community roots. Many have been working for decades on stream restoration and have since integrated fire and forest restoration into their missions. And just coming back to that funding piece, the challenge is how to get sustained state and federal funding to these critical partners.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, if anyone has any last minute questions, please post them in the chat. Otherwise, again, Dr. Charnley, thank you so much for taking the time today to give this excellent presentation and give us all of this information. And I really look forward to the next time.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.